Okay, so FNAF Security Breach has been out for a few now, and it's had time for fans to react to it. And with it being the worst rated FNAF title ever, clearly it may not be a positive start. But while I've already made a video talking about people's issues with the title, something that I saw more and more after its release was the community blaming fans for the title's main issue, that of which being the rushed and glitchy aspects of it that in some cases ruined the game experience entirely. But why do some people think this? Well, before we get into everyone's accusations and such, let's get a quick refresher as to what the issue actually is. So basically, Security Breach has had some delays leading up to the title's full release. Initially, the game was planned for a late 2020 release, being promised before Christmas. However, after that date was unfulfilled, Cawthon confirmed the delay and said that the title was going to be set for an early 2021 release instead. Now, fast forward to April 2021, while there were new trailers and teasers being shown for the title, there was no release in sight. And of course, this would eventually lead to one final delay to late 2021, which as we know was the actual release time of the title. So eventually the game comes out and fans are finally able to get their hands on it. But as everybody started trying the title, a lot of people had complaints about the game. More specifically, the fact that the game ended up being incredibly buggy. I mean, I saw tweets complaining about people no longer wanting to play the title over the glitches, and saw people beating the super ambitious, expansive FNAF title in literally under 5 minutes. There was also many issues with the fact that the AI was far from impressive, and oftentimes it would get stuck and even break, which in a game where the animatronics are supposed to scare us, it's really not threatening to see them all bugging out when just trying to walk. And speaking of which, the polishing of this game was just really poor, and things like the animatronics were clearly rushed, and it ended up really breaking the atmosphere of the title overall. So to me, it seems pretty clear that the title needed months extra time to finish itself just based on these factors, along with other storyline and plot issues I noticed people talking about. So clearly this was a big mess up on the developer's part, and hopefully these are bugs that will be fixed within the coming months. However, a lot of the reputation has already been tarnished from this poor initial launch. But while most people can agree that the game has started off pretty problematic, not everybody is blaming the developers for these issues, but rather are turning towards the fans, saying it was their fault for rushing the developers, pressuring them to release the game before it was actually finished. And this claim does have a bit of validity, because I mean, if you just looked anywhere on the internet before the title release, there would be somebody complaining about how long the wait was. There were a ton of memes regarding it, people actually attacking the developers, and many other examples of people criticizing this game's ability to release on time, especially after its second delay. So basically what a lot of people are theorizing is that the game was taking even longer than expected and was supposed to be delayed even more. However, the constant pressuring from fans to complete the title forced them to cut corners and rush it in order to fit the release date. This could also be backed up by the fact that the game was technically delayed a third time by a few hours on its actual release date, meaning that they had been working on the title literally all the way up to the minute it was launched. Most likely meaning they weren't able to get everything they were wanting to work on because of this tight constraint, that of which people are blaming fans for. So clearly this game was rushed, obviously. That's almost not even a question anymore. The real question now is if the fans were really the ones who caused this rushing. And while in the ways mentioned it does make sense, there also are a lot of factors that point towards the idea that this title may not be as negatively pressured by the fans as it was just poorly prepared for. The first thing that points towards this idea is the fact that they had to delay the game twice, and while the fans have been vocally upset about these delays, I honestly think that these pushbacks were at the fault of the developers at Steelwool Studios. I mean, when you think about it, especially during the first game's announcement, if the title wasn't going to be ready in time for its release date, it would have been much easier for the developers to just never announce a release date at all and keep working on it. And while obviously giving a release date helps to hype up the game, based on its very late 2021 release date, this call was way off, and they even admit to this mistake. During the original Reddit post where Cawthon announced the game's first delay, the entire post is how the game ended up being significantly larger than they were initially planning on, and they were gonna have to give it a few months before it would finally release. But looking at the second delay, we see once again the title ended up being poorly managed to the point where it was nowhere near completion by early 2021, and therefore there had to be another pushback to even later this year, which shows again that the title was planned for poorly and led to these constant delays. Now, as for when the game actually did end up coming out, I think as mentioned there could be an argument that these two delays were causing fans to outrage, leading to the company rushing the title to completion, but it also could have something to do with the fact that the devs really couldn't couldn't afford to keep delaying the game and just pushed it out for the sake of the game's rollout and build up rather than being affected by the fans, because let's be real, it seems like a lot of these companies don't seem to really care what fans have to say anyway. But regardless of the theories, the fact that this game is such a buggy mess is something that the company must have knew about, because when referring back to when they did delay the game literally on launch day, it showed that the title clearly wasn't yet finished and they knew they were releasing a buggy game, which honestly makes me a little bit upset to see, because the last thing I want is to have FNAF games rushed, especially ones of this magnitude. But when it comes down to just the core question of did the fans ruin Security Breach, while I think there's a fair argument to say that they definitely could have played a part in these poor selections of release dates or the many other factors that led to this game's horrible rollout, I believe that this game's poor quality really comes down to the fact that FNAF Security Breach was drawn out way over ambitiously. They had the idea to make a new FNAF that was actually in 3D and open world with new characters, new lore, new game style, new pretty much everything. And when this title was made up, especially when it's supposed to be AAA quality, there needs to be more time to produce and plan it out. Obviously, it must be incredibly exciting to work on the new title and get to show the information to the fans, but we see other big AAA titles like GTA 5 that took years on years to actually end up coming out, and GTA 6 is taking longer. But rather than them rushing the title or giving unplanned out release dates, these titles have planned out what they wanted to do, and they take their time to make it perfect. And while that series is to a way larger scale of FNAF Security Breach, that just helps prove the point that taking your time to make a video game when done correctly can still lead to a legendary title, especially if it's planned out properly. And we can see the title's ambition when we actually play it. I mean, imagine FNAF Security Breach but with no bugs and with everything polished and remastered. It would have been a wonderful game and people would have actually enjoyed it, unlike where we are now with an unflattering mess. In all fairness to the Security Breach team, looking past all the bugginess and other game quality issues with the title, it's still quite a good game, and within the next few months, most of these issues will be resolved anyway. I just think it's super upsetting to see these huge titles come out just like this one, among games like Cyberpunk 2077, that put so much ambition and care into the title, but break it all off by wanting to release it faster, something that in the grand scheme of things won't even matter in a few years to anybody looking at the franchise as a whole, but what will be noticed is how the game could potentially forever be regarded as underwhelming and disappointing. So overall, the game is a great on-concept title that unfortunately fell to the pressure of release dates, poor planning, and debatedly even the angry, demanding fans. I am willing to give this game a pass for the most part regardless though, because after a few months the game should be fine, and FNAF should live on well in a way that the retired creator Scott Cawthon would want. Just something that I touched on briefly that scares me for the entire history going forward for FNAF is the consistency of these games being dished out. Because I mean, we've seen both sides of the coin from these new developers who worked on this title, because they also successfully created FNAF Help Wanted, which ended up in my opinion being pretty good. I just really hope that this game's issues were a mere one-time fluke and FNAF doesn't start to ruin its legacy, because whether some people want to admit it or not, among all these indie games that I talk about that always end up dying and failing to stay consistent, FNAF for the most part is absent from that list. And despite Scott's departure, I pray that future titles roll out way more polished down the line and successfully build upon or at least sustain the legacy of FNAF as a whole. If you're bored and or want to learn more about what people didn't like about the title, watch this video here.